Hello, I'm Tom Montgomery Fate, an English faculty member at the College of DuPage. Today I'm pleased to welcome Stuart Dybek to campus as part of our English 150 class, Intro to Short Fiction. Stuart will be reading his short story, We Didn't, and afterwards we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the story and also about his thoughts on the craft of short fiction. It's my pleasure to welcome Stuart here today.
I'm going to read a story from a book of stories called I Sailed with Magellan, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the story before I read it. After it was published, it appeared in an anthology called Best American Stories, but in my mind, even though it made Best American Stories, it's a failed poem, because it started as a poem, which turned into the story. The way it started as a poem was that I was reading a volume of poems by one of my favorite poets, a poet who had numerous times been nominated for the Nobel Prize. He'd never won it, an Israeli poet named Yehuda Amichai. And I came upon a poem of his called We Did It, which caught my attention because I always felt that that phrase, doing it, was one of the tackier versions we had for sex. And so I tried to write a poem in response to it. And because Amichai's poem was, and that poem never went anywhere, but it turned into this story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Amichai's poem, and then I'm going to pause shortly, and then I'm just going to read my story so that you can see the relationship between the two of them. His poem is called We Did It, and this is Yehuda Amichai's poem. We did it in front of the mirror and in the light. We did it in darkness, in water, and in the high grass. We did it in honor of man, and in honor of beast, and in honor of God. But they didn't want to know about us. They'd already seen our sort. We did it with imagination and colors, with confusion of reddish hair and brown, and with difficult, gladdening exercises. We did it like wheels and holy creatures, and with chariot feats of prophets. We did it 6 wings and 6 legs, but the heavens were hard above us, like the earth of summer beneath. So this is my story. We didn't. We didn't in the light, we didn't in darkness, we didn't in the fresh-cut summer grass, or in the mounds of autumn leaves, or on the snow where moonlight threw down our shadows. We didn't in your room on the canopy bed you slept in, the bed you'd slept in as a child, or on the back seat of my father's rusted Rambler, which smelled of the smoked chubs and kielbasa he delivered on weekends for my Uncle Vincent's meat market. We didn't in your mother's Buick 8, where a rosary twined the rearview mirror like a beaded black snake with silver cruciform fangs. At the dead end of our lover's lane, a side street of abandoned factories, where I perfected the pinch that springs open a bra. Behind the lilac bushes in Marquette Park, where you first touched me through my jeans and your nipples swollen against transparent cotton seemed the shade of lilacs. In the balcony of the now defunct Clark Theater, where I wiped popcorn salt from my palms and slid them up your thighs, and you whispered, I feel like Doris Day is watching. We didn't. How adept we were at fumbling, how perfectly mistimed our timing, how utterly we confused energy with ecstasy. Remember that night, becalmed by heat and the two of us fused by sweat, trembling as if a wind from outer space that only we could feel was gusting across Oak Street Beach. Entwined in your faded Navajo blanket, we lay soul-kissing until you wept with wanting. We'd been kissing all day, all summer, kisses tasting of different shades of lip gloss and too many Cokes. The lake had turned hot pink, rose rapture, pearl amethyst with dusk, then washed in, night black with a ruff of silver foam. Beyond a momentary horizon, silent bolts of heat lightning throb, perhaps setting barns on fire somewhere in Indiana. The beach that had been so crowded was deserted, as if there was a curfew. Only the bodies of lovers remained, visible in lightning flashes, scattered like the fallen on a battlefield, a few of them moaning, waiting for the gulls to pick them clean. On my fingers, your slick scent mixed with the coconut musk of the suntan lotion we'd repeatedly smeared over each other's bodies. when your bikini top fell away. My hands caught your breasts, memorizing their delicate weight, my palms cupped as if bringing water to parched lips. Along the Gold Coast high-rises began to glow, window added to window against the dark. In every lighted bedroom, couples home from work were stripping off their business suits, falling to the bed and doing it. They did it before mirrors and pressed against the glass in streaming shower stalls. They did it against walls and on the furniture in ways that required previously unimagined gymnastics, which they invented on the spot. They did it in honor of man and woman, in honor of beast, in honor of God. They did it because they'd been released, because they were home free, alive, and private, because they couldn't wait any longer, couldn't wait for the appointed hour, for the right time or temperature, couldn't wait for the future, for messiahs, for peace on earth and justice for all. They did it because of the bomb, because of pollution, because of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because extinction might be just a blink away. They did it because it was Friday night. It was Friday night, and somewhere delirious music was playing. Flutter-tongued flutes, muted trumpets meowing like cats in heat, feverish plunking and twanging tom-toms, congas, gongs all pounding the same pulse beat. I stripped your bikini bottom down the skinny rails of your legs, and you tugged my swimsuit past my tan. Swimsuits at our ankles, we kicked like swimmers to free our legs, almost expecting a tide to wash over us, the way the tide rushes in on Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr in From Here to Eternity, a love scene so famous that although neither of us had seen the movie, our bodies assumed the exact position of movie stars on the sand, and you whispered to me softly, "I'm afraid of getting pregnant." And I whispered back, "Don't worry, I have protection." Then, still kissing you, felt for my discarded cutoffs and the wallet in which for the last several months I'd carried a Trojan as if it was a talisman. Still kissing, I tore its flat and dried out wrapper, and it sprang through my fingers like a spring from a clock and dropped to the sand between our legs. My hands were shaking. In a panic, I groped for it, found it, tried to dust it off, tried as Burt Lancaster never had to slip it on without breaking the mood, felt the grains of sand inside it, a throb of lightning, and the great lake behind us became, for all practical purposes, the Pacific, and your skin tasted of salt, and to the insistent question that my hips were asking, your body answered yes. Your thighs opened like wings from my waist as we surfaced, panting from a kiss that left you pleading, "Oh Christ, yes," a yes you gasped sharply as a cry of pain, so that for a moment I thought we were already doing it, and that somehow I had missed the instant when I entered you in the bloodless way in which a young man discards his own virginity, entered you as if passing through a gateway into the rest of my life, into a life as I wanted it to be lived. Yes, but oh, then I realized we were still floundering unconnected in the slick between us, and there was sand in the Trojan as we slammed together, feeling for that perfect fit, still in the here, grasping for an eternity that was only a fine adjustment away, just a millimeter to the left or a fraction of an inch further south, though with all the adjusting, the sandy Trojan was slipping off, and then it was gone, but you kept repeating, although your head was shaking, "No, not quite, almost," and our hearts were going like crazy, and you said, "Yes, yes, wait, stop." "What?" I asked, still futilely thrusting as if I hadn't quite heard you. "Oh, God," you gasped, pushing yourself up. "What's coming?" "Jin, what's the matter?" I asked, confused, and then the beam of a spotlight swept over us, and I glanced into its blinding eye. All around us, lights were coming, speeding across the sand. Blinking blindness away, I rolled from your body to my knees, feeling utterly defenseless in a way that only nakedness can leave one feeling. Headlights bounded toward us, spotlights crisscrossing, blue dome lights revolving as squad cars converged. I could see other lovers caught in the beams, fleeing bare-assed through the litter of garbage that daytime hordes had left behind and that night had deceptively concealed. You were crying, clutching the Navajo blanket to your breast with one hand, clawing for your bikini with the other. And I was trying to calm your terror with reassuring phrases such as, "Holy shit, I don't fucking believe this." Swerving and fishtailing in the sand, police calls pouring from their radios, the squad cars were on us, and then they were by us while we struggled to pull on our clothes. They braked at water's edge, and cops slammed out, brandishing huge flashlights, their beams deflecting over the dark water. Beyond the darting of those beams, the far-off throbs of lightning seemed faint by comparison. "Over there, goddammit," one of them hollered, and two cops slashed out into the shallow water without even pausing to kick off their shoes, huffing aloud for breath, their leather cartridge belts creaking against their bellies. "Grab the son of a bitch, it ain't gonna bite," one of them yelled. And they came sloshing back to shore with a body slung between them. It was a woman, young, naked, her body limp, the bluish beneath the play of flashlight beams. They set her on the sand just past the ring of drying, washed-up alewives. Her face was almost totally concealed by her hair. Her hair was brown and tangled in a way that even wind or sleep can't tangle hair, tangled as if it had absorbed the ripples of water, thick strands, slimy-looking like dead seaweed. "She's been in there a while, that's for sure," a cop with a beer belly said to a younger crew-cut cop who'd knelt beside the body and removed his hat as if he might be considering the kiss of life. The crew-cut officer brushed the hair away from her face, and the flashlight beam settled there. Her eyes were closed. A bruise or a birthmark stained the side of one eye. Her features appeared swollen, her lower lip protruding as if she was pouting. An ambulance siren echoed across the sand, its revolving red light rapidly approaching. "Might as well take their sweet-ass time," the beer-bellied cop said. We had joined the circle of police surrounding the drowned woman almost without realizing we had. You were back in your bikini, robed in the Navajo blanket, and I had slipped on my cutoffs, my underwear dangling out of a back pocket. Their flashlight beams explored her body, causing its whiteness to gleam. Her breasts were floppy. Her nipples looked shriveled. Her belly appeared inflated by gallons of water. For a moment, a beam focused on her mound of pubic hair, which was overlapped by the swell of her belly, and then moved almost shyly away down her legs, and the cops all glanced at us, at you especially above their lights, and you hugged your blanket closer as if they might confiscate it as evidence or to use as a shroud. When the ambulance pulled up, one of the black attendants immediately put a stethoscope to the drowned woman's swollen belly and announced, "Drowned the baby, too." Without saying anything, we turned from the group as unconsciously as we joined them and walked off across the sand, stopping only long enough at the spot where we had lain together like lovers in order to stuff the rest of our gear into a beach bag, to gather our shoes, and for me to find my wallet and kick sand over the forlorn, deflated Trojan that you pretended not to notice. I was grateful for that. Behind us, the police were snapping photos, flashbulbs throbbing like flashing lights, and the lightning itself, still distant, but moving in closer, rumbling audibly now, driving a lake wind before it so that the gusts of sand tingled against the metal sides of the ambulance. Squinting as we walked toward the lighted windows of the Gold Coast, while the shadows of gapers attracted by the whirling emergency lights hurried past us, we heard them say, "What happened? What's going on?" And then they didn't wait for an answer, and we didn't offer one. Just continued walking, silently in the dark. It was only later that we talked about it. And once we began talking about the drowned woman, it seemed we couldn't stop. She was pregnant, you said. I mean, I don't want to sound morbid, but I can't help thinking how the whole time we almost, there was this poor dead woman and her unborn child washing in and out behind us. It's not like we could have done anything for her even if we had known she was there, I said. But what if we had found her? What if we had, after, you said, your eyes glancing away from mine and your voice tailing into a whisper, what if after we did it, we went for a night swim and found her in the water? But Jen, we didn't, I tried to reason. Though it was no more a matter of reason than anything between us had ever been. It began to seem as if each time we went somewhere to make out, on the back porch of your half-deaf, whiskery Italian grandmother who sat in front of the apartment cackling at I Love Lucy reruns, or at your girlfriend Tina's basement rec room when her parents were away on bowling league nights and Tina was upstairs with her current crush, Brad, or way off in the burbs at the Giant Twin Drive-In during the weekend they called Elvis Fest. The drowned woman was with us. We would kiss, your mouth would open, When your tongue flicked repeatedly after mine, I would unbutton the first button of your blouse, revealing a beauty spot at the base of your throat, which matched the smaller spot I loved above a corner of your lips, and then a second button which opened on a delicate gold cross, which I had always tried to regard as merely a fashion statement, dangling above the cleft of your breasts. The third button exposed the lacy swell of your bra, and I would slide my hand over the patterned mesh, feeling for the firmness of your nipple, rising to my fingertip. But you would pull slightly away, and behind your rapid breath, your kiss would grow distant, and I would kiss harder, trying to lure you back from wherever you'd gone. And finally holding you, as if only consoling a friend, I'd ask, "What are you thinking?" Although, of course, I knew. I don't want to think about her, but I can't help it. I mean, it seems like some kind of weird omen or something, you know? No, I don't know, I said. It was just a coincidence. Maybe if she'd been farther away down the beach, but she was so close to us, a good wave could have washed her right up beside us. Great. Then we could have had a menage a trois. Gross. I don't believe you just said that. Just because you said it in French doesn't make it less disgusting. You're driving me to it. Come on, Jen, I'm sorry, I said. I was just making a dumb joke to get a little different perspective on things. What's so goddamn funny about a woman who drowned herself and her baby? We don't even know for sure she did. Yeah, right. It was just an accident. She just happened to be going for a walk, pregnant and naked, and she fell in. She could have been on a sailboat or something. Accidents happen. So do murders. Oh, like murder makes it less horrible? Don't think that hasn't occurred to me. Maybe the bastard who knocked her up killed her, huh? How should I know? You're the one who says you don't want to talk about it and then gets obsessed with all kinds of theories and scenarios. Why are we arguing about a woman we don't even know, who doesn't have the slightest thing to do with us? I do know about her, you said. I dream about her. You dream about her, I repeated, surprised. Dreams you remember? Sometimes they wake me up. In one, I'm at my Nana's cottage in Michigan, swimming for a raft that keeps drifting farther away until I'm too tired to turn back. Then I notice there's a naked person sunning on the raft, and I start yelling, "Help!" And she looks up and offers me a hand, but I'm too afraid to take it, even though I'm drowning, because it's her. God, Jen, that's creepy. I dreamed you and I are on the beach and you bring us a couple hot dogs but forget the mustard, so you have to go all the way back to the stand for it. Wait, hot dogs, no mustard, a little Freudian, isn't it? Honest to God, I dreamed it. You go back for the mustard, and I'm wondering why you're gone so long. Then a woman screams a kid is drowned, and everyone stampedes for the water, and I'm swept in by the mob and forced under, and I think, this is it, I'm going to drown. But I'm able to hold my breath longer than could ever be possible. It feels like a flying dream, flying underwater. And then I see this baby down there flying too and realize it's the kid everyone thinks is drowned, but he's no more drowned than I am. He looks like Cupid, or one of those baby angels that cluster around the face of God. Pretty weird, I said. What do you think the symbols mean? Hot dogs, water, drowning. It means the baby who drowned inside her that night was a love child, a boy, and his soul was released to wander through the water. You don't really believe that. We argued about the interpretation of dreams, about whether dreams are symbolic or psychic, prophetic or just plain nonsense, until you said, look, Dr. Freud, you can believe what you want about your dreams, but keep your nose out of mine, okay? We argued about the drowned woman, about whether her death was a suicide or a murder, about whether her appearance that night was an omen or a coincidence, which, you argued, is what an omen is anyway, a coincidence that means something. But by the end of summer, even when we were no longer arguing about the woman, we had acquired the habit of arguing about everything else. What was better, dogs or cats, rock or jazz, Cubs or Sox, tacos or egg rolls, right or left, night or day? We could argue about it all. It no longer required arguing or necking to summon up the drowned woman. Everywhere we went, she surfaced, by her own volition, at Rocky's Italian Beef, at Lindo, Mexico, at the House of Dong, our favorite Chinese restaurant, a place we still frequented because when we first started seeing each other, they had let us sit and talk until late over tiny cups of jasmine tea and broken fortune cookies. We would always kid about going there. Are you in the mood for Dong tonight, I'd ask. conspiratorially. It was a dopey joke, meant for you to roll your eyes at its repeated dopiness. Back then in winter, if one of us ordered the garlic shrimp, we would both be sure to eat them so that later our mouths tasted the same when we kissed. Even when she wasn't mentioned, she was there with her drowned body so dumpy next to yours, and her sad breasts with their wrinkled nipples and sour milk so saggy beside yours, which were still budding, with her swollen belly and her pubic bush colorless in the glare of electric light, with her tangled, slimy hair and her pouting, placid face so lifeless beside yours, and her skin a pallid white, lightning flash white, flash bulb white, a whiteness that couldn't be duplicated in daylight. How I'd come to hate that pallor so cold beside the flush of your skin. There wasn't a particular night when we finally broke up, just as there wasn't a particular night when we began going together. But it was a night in fall I guessed it was over. We were parked in the Rambler at the dead end of the street of factories that had been our lover's lane, listening to a drizzle of rain and dry leaves sprinkle the hood. As always, rain revitalized the smells of smoked fish and kielbasa in the upholstery. The radio was on too low to hear. The windshield wiper swished at intervals as if we were driving. And the windows were steamed as if we'd been making out. But we'd been arguing, as usual, this time about a woman poet who had committed suicide, whose work you were reading. We were sitting, no longer talking or touching, and I remember thinking I didn't want to argue with you anymore. I didn't want to sit like this in hurt silence. I wanted to talk excitedly all night as we once had. I wanted to find some way that wasn't corny sounding to tell you how much fun I'd had in your company, how much knowing you had meant to me, and how I had suddenly realized I'd been so intent on becoming lovers that I'd overlooked how close we'd been as friends. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to like me again. It's sad, I started to say, meaning that I was sorry we had reached the point of sitting in silence, but before I could continue, you challenged the statement. What makes you so sure it's sad? What do you mean, what makes me so sure? I asked, confused by your question. You looked at me as if what was sad was that I would never understand. For all either one of us knows, you said, death could have been her triumph. Maybe when it really ended was the night I felt we had just begun. That one time on the beach in the summer when our bodies rammed so desperately together that for a moment I thought we did it. And maybe in our hearts we did, although for me then, doing it in one's heart didn't quite count. If it did, I supposed we'd all be Casanovas. We rode home together on the L that night, and I felt sick and defeated in a way I was embarrassed to mention. Our mute reflections emerged like negative exposures on the dark, greasy window of the train. Lightning branched over the city, and when the train entered the subway tunnel, the lights inside flickered as if the power was disrupted, though the train continued rocketing beneath the loop. When the train emerged again, we were on the south side of Chicago, and it was pouring. A deluge, as if the sky had opened to drown the innocent and guilty alike. We hurried from the L station to your house, holding the Navajo blanket over our heads until soaked it collapsed. In the dripping doorway of your apartment building, we said goodnight. You were shivering. Your bikini top showed through the thin blouse plastered to your skin. I swept the wet hair away from your face and kissed you lightly on the lips. Then you turned and went inside. I stepped into the rain and you came back out calling after me. What? I asked, feeling a surge of gladness to be summoned back into a doorway with you. Want an umbrella? I didn't. The downpour was letting up. It felt better to walk back to the station feeling the rain rinse the sand out of my hair, off my legs, until the only places where I could still feel its grit were in the crotch of my cutoffs and in each squish of my shoes. A block down the street, I passed a pair of jockey shorts lying in a puddle and realized they were mine, dropped from my back pocket as we ran to your house. I left them behind, wondering if you'd see them and recognize them the next day. By the time I had climbed the stairs back to the L platform, the rain had stopped. Your scent still hadn't washed from my fingers. The station, the entire city, it seemed, dripped and steamed. The summer sound of crickets and nighthawks echoed from the drenched neighborhood. Alone, I could admit how sick I felt. For you, it was a night that would haunt your dreams. For me, it was another night when I waited, swollen and aching, for what I had secretly nicknamed the Blue Ball Express. Literally lovesick, groaning inwardly with each lurch of the train, and worried I was damaged for good, I peered out at the passing, yellow-lit stations where lonely men stood, posted before giant advertisements, pictures of glamorous models defaced by graffiti, the same old scrawled insults and pleas, fuck you, eat me. At this late hour, the world seemed given over to men without women, men waiting in abject patience for something indeterminate, the way I waited for our next times. I avoided their eyes so that they wouldn't see the pity in mine, pity for them because I'd just been with you. Your scent was still on my hands, and there seemed to be so much future ahead. For me, it was another night like that. And by the time I reached my stop, I knew I would be feeling better, recovered enough to walk the dark street home, making up poems of longing I never wrote down. I was the D.H. Lawrence of not doing it, the voice of all the would-be lovers who ached and squirmed. From our contortions in doorways, on stairwells, and in the bucket seats of cars, we could have composed a Kama Sutra of interrupted bliss. It must have been that night when I recalled all the other times of walking home after seeing you, so that it seemed as if I was falling into step behind a parade of my former selves. Myself walking home on the night we first kissed. Myself on the night when I unbuttoned your blouse and kissed your breasts. Myself on the night when I lifted your skirt above your thighs and dropped to my knees. Each succeeding self, another step closer to that irrevocable moment for which our lives seemed poised. But we didn't. Not in the moonlight or by the phosphorescent lanterns of lightning bugs in your backyard. Not beneath constellations we couldn't see, let alone decipher. Or in the dark glow that replaced the real darkness of night, a darkness already stolen from us. Not with the skyline rising behind us while the city gradually decayed. Not in the heat of summer while a cold war raged. Despite the freedom of youth and license of first love, because of fate, karma, luck, what does it matter? We made not doing it a wonder, and yet we didn't. We didn't. We never did.
Stuart, welcome back to College of DuPage. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Tim.
I wanted, before we talk about your story that you read, I wanted to ask you some questions more about your own history as a writer. Could you say a little bit about how did you become interested in writing? I know you have always been interested in the arts and in music, and you're a poet and a short story writer. What are the roots of that?
Well, I mean, that's one of those questions that you could answer in a variety of ways. Certainly the fact that my mother read to us when we were kids, and that was, my brother and I were pretty wild, and yet we would always simmer down when it was evening reading time. The fact that the guys I grew up with in my neighborhood, which was on the south side of Chicago, loved telling stories. At night, we'd sit around and tell stories, and so just that love of stories certainly figured in there. Later on, and then there was the comic impulse. I mean, mainly we told stories to be funny, and I was kind of a class cut-up and clown, not a good student, but I began realizing that stories could do other things besides make jokes out of life. And you mentioned music, so music became very important to me. And music is about conveying feelings. And the only feelings that I managed to convey when I was playing were feelings of horror because I was such a bad saxophone player. So, but I seemed to have a little bit more success when I would try to convey those same feelings through language. So I kind of switched my allegiance over finally out of desperation. Everybody's relief. At least when somebody's writing poorly, you don't hear them.
Well, another thing that interests me is that you're, like many writers, both a poet and a fiction writer, and I know that you're a graduate of the Writers' Workshop many, many years ago. Did you start in poetry and then move into fiction, or other way around? Or
no, I always wrote them both simultaneously.
Okay.
And you know, when you're young and you're writing, you don't know that you're supposed to pick a genre.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of our writing culture, at least the way it's gotten into universities, is that everything in universities is divided into genres, and so you kind of get the message that you need to specialize in one genre or another. But if you look back at writers over history, any number of them have written and continue to write in a variety of genres. So a lot of poets write nonfiction, and you know, Chekhov, the great short story writer, was also a spectacularly good dramatist, and so I didn't really make a huge distinction, and still don't. Yeah.
Well, it's striking that both the coast of Chicago and I sailed with Magellan, there's, you know, particularly I guess the coast of Chicago, it's experimenting with the short story, the longer short story, and it's all very economically condensed with this kind of emotional acuity in some of your images that feels like a poem almost.
The story we didn't that is an example of along with, say, a story like Pet Milk, stories that started as poems. So it's not uncommon for me to have a story start as a poem, and even though it turns into a story, it kind of has poetry in its DNA, so to speak. And
I've had a number of students read this story, and we've talked about it, and there's always a high interest for a lot of reasons. And they talk about it as being both tragic and comic, like that there is this sense of brutality and light coming of ageness. Like, how did that happen, and do you see that in there too, and is there a tension of opposites?
I'm always looking for some opportunity, or if you want to use, say, basketball terms, a move in which two states of feeling can be contrasted, because it seems to me it makes for kind of a complex story to do that. And in music, there's a move called Counterpoint, where so this is kind of a fictional. So in We Didn't, what's counterpointed is a very comic scene on a beach with a sudden, horribly tragic, unexplained death. And in some of the other stories I've written, a counterpoint would be a story would start out to be very real, so that you were absolutely sure that you were dealing with realism, and then some otherworldly event would occur, and suddenly you would counterpoint the real and the surreal, or the real and the unreal, the real and the fantastic. And it's just a move that I like, because it kind of puts the reader in an ambiguous position, and if you don't lose the reader, hopefully you don't, then it kind of makes the reader a little bit more alert as to just exactly what's going to happen. The story becomes less predictable.
So this tension of opposites, is that the goal when a short story writer puts that kind of paradox in there to create complexity, or?
Yeah, I like that term, and I'll steal it from you in the future.
Which one?
The tension of opposites.
Yeah, I don't think it's mine. Yeah, because it's striking just in terms of love too. There's this kind of romantic love and the lightness of that age, and on the beach, and all of a sudden the brutality of the body washing in, and then you contrast a body in love with a dead body that washes up. That is the end result. Procreation has happened and the baby's died. Right. And that's, do you think this stuff out?
No, in fact, I was just about to say, that what you just asked me absolutely anticipates what I was just about to say, which is that in retrospect, as a reader, if I read that story, I suddenly see that those elements are in it. But when I'm writing it, it just seemed, on some gut instinctive level, it just seems to me, hey, it's a good story that these two people are making out on the beach, and suddenly this awful thing happens. Mm-hmm. And that's really all I need as a writer to. And what I'm trying to do from that point on is not interpret that story. I'm just trying to capture that story. So all my energy is going into trying to make that beach seem real, mm-hmm. to make those two people seem real, to make what it's like to, when you're not experienced sexually and you're at that stage of your life where you have all these drives, but you don't have the sophistication maybe that comes later, to try to make that real. And the magic of fiction is that all that other stuff that is done in a literary interp class happens on its own. I mean, one way that writers sometimes talk about writing is that writing, using the craft of writing, makes you smarter than you are. Mm. If you just try to tell the story, those other things will happen and fall into place. And I've noticed sometimes when I go into classes and talk to classes, especially in high school, the students are actually often suspicious about things like symbolism, and they'll say to me, "Did you really think that the street lights flickering off meant that the kid was about to die?" And I'll say no, and then they'll turn to their teacher and they'll look with that aha look on their face. But I'll have to add, well, I didn't think about it, but the way writing works is that those things will automatically happen. So just because I didn't think it out doesn't mean that I didn't suspect and hope something would be in there. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, I mean, I'll add one last thing, which is that the difference between readers and the audience for a lot of other art forms is that writing demands that readers are much more active participants. And so reading is a tremendously creative act. It's not a passive act. Mm-hmm. It's like dancing is to music. It's the closest thing to reading is dancing. And so readers bring these ideas to stories, and that's part of the creative process of reading.
You mean like the lens of experience that the reader brings that views this, in other words, if I'm 25 and I had an experience in adolescence and I bring that lens of experience and see it in a particular way, that each reader sees it that way? Is that what you mean?
You bring your experience, you bring your own imagination. Mm. Because stories depend entirely on a person's imagination. That is, we're not seeing them on a screen. We're not seeing them in a picture. It's language. It's totally abstract. It's really hard to say where a story takes place. It doesn't it's not the writing on the page exactly. There's like a screen in your mind. Mm. But it's so dependent on the readers, on giving the reader's imagination certain triggers, that once you trigger a reader's imagination, then you get that imaginative participation in a story. And I think that's part of the enormous pleasure in reading, mm-hmm. that it's triggering some imaginative quality in you.
And this is, you write fiction and poetry, and it's not nonfiction, and but we know that fiction writers, most fiction is autobiographical in some sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, you've received a lot of acclaim in the last few years as a Chicago writer. Studs Terkel and others have compared you to Nelson Algren and Saul Bellow and some of the great writers from the Midwest and from Chicago. You've taught for a number of years at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo as an English professor. Do you see yourself as a Chicago writer, and what does that mean, or how does that come to mean? You grew up here, but how do you think about that?
Well, I see myself as a writer of place. And that means that there's this huge tradition of writers who, whether they're British or from the American South, like William Faulkner or Eudora Welty, or from Ireland, like James Joyce, or, all the Russian writers. I mean, over and over and over again, one way to think about a writer is what place is that writer representing. Mm-hmm. Not every writer is a writer of place, but there's certainly a big tradition of that. My place happens to be Chicago. I grew up here. It somehow strongly imprinted me not just the city, but even the little narrower neighborhood I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Chicago writers, because Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, most Chicago writers have staked out one neighborhood or another. James Farrell stakes out the southeast side. Saul Bellow stakes out Hyde Park and the area around University of Chicago. Algren from Milwaukee Avenue. So my little area is Pilsen and Little Village. But the way I would define whether a writer is a Chicago writer or a Southern writer or an Irish or a Dublin writer, as Joyce is, would be if their subject matter is, if the city or the area is part of their subject matter. Okay. So for instance, Ernest Hemingway came from Oak Park. Mm-hmm. I would not call Ernest Hemingway an Oak Park writer. Mm-hmm. You know, the guy was born and raised in Oak Park. He never wrote about it.
Right.
And, whereas Alex Kotlowitz wasn't born at all in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And yet he's written a wonderful book on Chicago. So I would say, you know, in that regard, Alex Kotlowitz is, at least in those two terrific books he wrote on the city, is in fact a Chicago writer, because it's the city is a subject. I wanted to close up with a final question here, and I want to turn back to We Didn't for a minute, and about resolution in stories and the feeling of closure or how a story ends. And this story is from your novel and stories, I Sailed with Magellan, and the protagonist's name is Perry Kotzik. And Perry, in the end of the story, I'm curious how you perceive the resolution of this story. Is Perry full of relief? Is he full of regret? Is he full of curiosity? Is he full of gratitude? Is he full of wonder? Or is he full of bewilderment? Or how do you want the readers to feel there? Or is it an open, or did you mean it to be open to the reader? Yeah, there's a kind of ending called the open ending, mm-hmm. in which there isn't a strong single resolution, but
it's more like an ellipsis,
series of possibilities.
Yeah.
That might, in fact, all exist simultaneously, which I think is the way we live a lot anyway. That sometimes in conversation, you try to boil things down to a single emotion, but actually you're holding conflicting and alternative emotions even at the same time. And that, I suppose that would be the closest explanation of my intention for that particular ending, that he's remained that even now, looking back, he's still in a kind of a neutral. Not that he doesn't have any feelings, but that there's such a complex of feelings there that he doesn't exactly reach a resolution. Although I think, given the fact that the story is told in retrospect, there is an overriding feeling such that the older writer is feeling affection and forgiving toward his younger self, even as he sees his younger self as a kind of a screw up, in that he at some point in the story, Perry himself says he was, you know, he's so obsessed with doing it that he's missing all these other aspects in the relationship. So.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you have so many kind of charged images where you kind of frame these moments, and they're just almost like a pebble in a pond, and the rings keep growing as you read through the book. I think that's something I really admired about that, and they all kind of blend together in the history. Anything new in the pipeline for Stuart Dybek? Any new projects? Or you've been on a book tour, or you've got?
I have. I'm touring.
You have a new book of poetry out,
and of poems. Yeah.
And, Streets in Their Own Ink.
Streets in Their Own Ink, which is also all urban.
Yeah.
I actually have another book of poems just about done, which, for the sake of the departure from the usual, if nothing else, is all set in the Caribbean, where I lived for a couple of years.
Huh.
And I'm kind of thinking of the two books in tandem, in that I got to pick the cover for Streets in Their Own Ink, and it's very inky.
Yeah. Is that a painting?
It's a painting.
Yeah, I like it very much.
And there's a tradition of paintings called the nocturne, just like there is in music.
Mm-hmm.
And the Caribbean book, of course, is drenched in light. So I'm thinking of doing a night, having done a night book, and now trying to do a day book. And that
day book. Well, thank you for coming, Stuart. It's been
Thanks,
wonderful
Tom.
talking with
Yeah,
you, and appreciate
pleasure
you
to be
coming
here.
in.
Yeah, thank you.